afternoon to all of you here in Singapore. I am Kumar Ramakrishna, Professor of National Security Studies and Dean of the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University here in Singapore. Great pleasure to welcome all of you to today's webinar in RSIS. Very busy day for us, multiple events going on, but very glad you can join us. The seminar is on climate change and violent extremism, and this is being organized by the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism Research, or ICPVTR, which is of course part of RSIS. So this webinar explores the link between two of the most pressing issues of our time, climate change and violent extremism. These challenges represent significant threats to the current and future stability of human societies, intensifying competition for resources, and as we all know, inciting destabilizing internal and external conflicts as well. Yet, the fundamental link between climate change and violent extremism remains, perhaps surprisingly, relatively underexplored. Hence, today's webinar will help us better understand this research gap by illustrating how climate change increases grievances and fuels humans' insecurity through indirect and non-linear pathways, therefore raising the potential for violent extremism. Speaking today are four scholars who will share their individual perspectives and arguments to help us better understand the links between climate change and violent extremism. It is hoped that as a result of today's exchange of ideas, there will be increased interest in deepening interest and research into this very real nexus between climate change and violent extremism. Let me now briefly introduce the four excellent speakers who will be sharing their views with us today. We have Dr. Dylan O'Driscoll, Associate Professor at the Center for Peace and Security at Coventry University in the UK. Dylan is also Associate Senior Fellow at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI, in Sweden. We are also very pleased to have with us Dr. Florian Krampe, Director of the Climate Change and Risk Program at SIPRI. Dr. Fathima Azmiya Badurdeen is also with us. Welcome. She's a postdoctoral researcher at the Faculty of Religion, Culture and Society at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, and she is also Senior Lecturer at the Department of Social Sciences, Technical University of Mombasa in Kenya. Last but not least, we have a very familiar face in RSIS, Dr. Noor Huda Ismail, who is a visiting fellow in RSIS and who is one of Southeast Asia's leading scholar practitioners in the violent extremism space. We certainly look forward to hearing from this panel of very well-positioned and knowledgeable scholars who will no doubt provide us with much meat to chew on and will lead us in an enriching discussion, which I will be very happy and honored to moderate. As we have agreed, each speaker will have about 15 minutes for their presentations, and after that, we will have a moderated discussion. First up, as agreed, will be, may I invite Florian Krampe to sort of get us going. Thanks very much. Florian, please.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you for hosting us today. Really excellent, and it's a great pleasure to work with RSIS on this really important topic. And as you pointed out, a topic that needs more attention and especially also more research. I probably don't take my 15 minutes. I want to be short because I think it will be great to hear from the case studies on the field. I want to sketch a little bit for us the frame where we are and to sketch out a little bit of like where are we now, how do we get there, and what do I think that we need to do to move forward. As you rightly pointed out, one thing we're seeing today is that there is a nascent link between climate change and violent extremism, and that is not that is stemming from a lot of the research that has been going on in the field around climate change and insecurity over the last couple of decades. The field emerged very much in the 2000s, building on initial research on environmental security, but then moving forward to also highlight the issue of climate change and climate change and security. What the research on climate change and security shows us today is that climate change increases the risk of violent conflict. It increases the probability of violent conflict. And how that exactly plays out is certainly different. Causality in social science is seldomly, and especially in the study of violence and conflict issues, is rather never straightforward. But we see that there are clear linkages where climate change is a contributing factor to violence. It's compounding and playing out on the dynamics. One of the key things that research is showing us in that respect is the role of impact that climate change has on people's livelihoods, as one of the key steps on translating the physical impacts of natural or of the natural environment of environmental change into the social and political realities of climate change. In our work, we're focusing specifically on a couple of pathways to guide us through the understanding, but that is not the key thing here. But what we have seen, we have studied this now in multiple regions, and we're seeing livelihood deterioration playing a key role. We're seeing migration and mobility pattern playing a key role. We're seeing that elite exploitation and resource mismanagement is playing a key role, but we also see that the role of armed actors is an important factor that we need to pay attention to. Much of that discussion has traditionally focused on the military and more conventional armed actors, but more and more in the research over the last pretty much five years, I think we have seen and come to note that there are also different dynamics where insurgent groups are able to take advantage of the dynamics and how climate change is influencing the landscape. We see that in cases like Mali and others where it is almost used as a tactical opportunity to attack some of the peacekeeping compounds in the midst of a sandstorm, etc., sort of using that for their advantage. But also in there is a key dynamic that we have seen that links to questions of recruitment. And what I found in research that we did in Somalia specifically interesting is, I guess the economic argument is one that probably in this relationship we very quickly come to think of, right? If you're losing your livelihoods, if somebody gives you an economic incentive to join an armed group, you might be able to do that, or you might be considering to do that. So that incentive is there. We're seeing evidence of that in multiple cases. But what I found striking is another dynamic in there. If through the impact that climate change has on destroying people's livelihoods, a part of identity gets lost for a lot of those peoples as well. And we have seen several cases where it is actually not the economic incentive where people are joining an extremist group or an insurgency. It's not the cause of the insurgency, but it is a sense of belonging, like being part, having lost an identity before and finding a new identity in this space. I think that is a really important dynamic to not oversimplify the dynamic around recruitment in this space, but to see really where are the different incentives. So there's a lot of research that is starting to pop up in this field now around violent extremism, and we'll hear several speakers later that are doing some excellent research on that. But so that is just to give you a little bit of the backstory of where this came from, right? In the study from the climate change and security perspective. So 2 points to end with on what do I think that we need. Policy actors have to recognize that this link exists. not to overstate the link, right? There's like in all of these contexts we're talking about, a lot of things are going on, a lot of complex security issues are playing out, a lot of complex responses are playing out. But we need to make this part of the story of understanding how the dynamics are playing out on the ground, and policy actors, especially the humanitarian and peace-building actors in the field, need to take these things into account and consider how this is impacting their dynamics. Think about security sector reform. Obviously, if climate change is a factor, that is typically not a response you would get from the field from somebody working there on those issues, that they are really taking this into account, right? Because there's a lot of other issues. But we have to start taking this into account also to just collect more evidence on site and take these things into consideration. And there's an element of that is really important. I stress the point of like that in the climate security space, pretty much everything works through livelihoods. And that is really important to put also front and center in the policy response side. It's not going to be a military response. It's not going to be a security forces response. It's a livelihood development response that needs to be part of it, right? That needs to be front and center. It needs to be a much more comprehensive approach to security thinking than sometimes we see with regard to violent extremism. And the last point is around the question of research, that we need to dig into this substantially more. Now we have indications from a lot of cases. We have some initial first studies popping up, but there's a real need to substantiate this through further research and find the ways of also studying this relationship in a proper way. And I think that Dr. O'Driscoll will dive into that a bit more. I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Florian, for getting the ball rolling and sketching out some of the essential issues to think about in terms of the climate change and violent extremism space. And I was particularly struck by what you were saying, that it's not simply, while it is a lot of the challenges arise from the impact of climate on livelihoods, there's also identity issues involved, and that really struck me as something which is very, very pertinent for the violent extremism space as well. So with that, over to you, Dylan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kumar, and also RSIS for organizing this, my fellow panelists, and also for you, those of you joining us in the audience. So I think, yeah, Florian has given us quite a good overview of kind of where we are with climate security and some of the kind of emerging areas in violent extremism. As usual, as soon as I start speaking, a cat jumps up onto their counter. So yeah, I think what I would like to do is to provide a little bit of an insight into where we are with our understanding of the intersection between climate change and violent extremism, but also to kind of highlight a few core areas that I think need our attention. As Florian highlighted, I think we need to come up with a comprehensive framework of analysis, because in order to develop responses, we need to understand the intersection in different contexts. So the development of a framework, I think, is an important first step. So I think we could all agree that there's an overwhelming consensus that climate change is, one of the major challenges currently facing humankind. It is already, and it will continue to disrupt social, economic, and political systems. And as Florian has highlighted, evidence already exists that it is interacting with and exacerbating conflict to some extent. However, I think violent extremism also poses a major societal challenge. We are seeing violent extremist movements fostering, expanding, and intensifying a wide range of conflicts globally. And I think for this reason, it's really important that we understand the intersection between the two. I have kind of in the literacy, I think it is starting to develop. We're at a nascent stage. However, as I already mentioned, there's the missing kind of wider framework to understand and analyze this. I also think there's a tendency to kind of lump violent extremism with conflict, rather than looking at it distinctly. And I think this is an issue because it lacks nuance. The term violent extremism exists for a reason, to differentiate violent groups associated with transnational ideological movements from other conflict actors. As we know, violent extremism knows no borders, and I think it's really important that the intersection between violent extremism and climate change is understood separate from conflicts rather than just seen within the conflict, security, climate lens. So as we have mentioned, there's a lack of a systematic effort to understand the relationship between climate change and violent extremism, and this is a problem. The intersection between the two comprises part of a unique and complex system rather than part of the broader system. And if we are going to intervene at one part, we need to understand this, otherwise there'll be negative consequences elsewhere. So we currently are seeing major efforts to address climate change. We're also seeing major efforts to address violent extremism. But the question is, how do we bring these together in practice and policy where we can have a systematic view of addressing both of them together? I think at a minimum, interventions must be sensitive and monitor for potential side effects, but ideally we would like to bring them together. I think we've already seen climate adaptation responses actually kind of have negative impacts on violent extremism. For example, in Mali, we have seen, the focus of climate adaptation responses on one community, which has created animosity and resentment and also driven violent extremism. At the same time, I think more thought out climate adaptation can create economic opportunities and also increase community resilience, which is important if we're trying to counter and prevent violent extremism. So I think there is also a link where climate adaptation can be used to prevent and counter violent extremism. So it's important that we start to see how we would bring these two together. For me, at least, for PCVE to be sustainable, it must incorporate climate adaptation. That's just where we're going. And I would argue vice versa, that climate adaptation should also incorporate PCVE. I think, as I already mentioned, the development of an analytical framework is a first important step if we are going to develop such responses, because we need to understand how these are interacting. With that in mind, I would like to talk about 4 core key areas that I think we need to be part of a framework and that I will map out and also highlight that they need more research. Florian has already dipped into some of them, so maybe there'll be slight repetition, but I would like to still speak about them because I think I'm trying to highlight them as 4 distinct areas. So the first that I would like to speak about is the drivers. This is obviously a key one that we will speak about, because when we're thinking about violent extremism, we think of what are the drivers of violent extremism. So we're already seeing that climate change is interacting and exacerbating violent extremism. Now while the drivers of violent extremism are, I think, complex and much debated, I think we can agree that there are a number of core drivers. Some of them include marginalization, governance failure, social boundary hardening, poverty, and inequality. And in a number of settings, the negative impacts of climate change are directly exacerbating these, because there is a close link between climate impacts and these drivers. For example, if we, as Florian mentioned, the destruction of livelihoods, increased resource scarcity, population displacement, and reduced government penetration into communities of the margins. All these are very closely connected to existing drivers of violent extremism. So what they do is the negative climate impacts are likely to exacerbate these existing drivers. So they're not creating drivers, but they're exacerbating what already exists. Also, I think there is the double burden of people living with both climate change, the negative impacts of climate change, and violent extremism. This makes people's lives more difficult, and then naturally is going to exacerbate some of the drivers around these factors. So we need to, for me, we need to understand this. How is climate change interacting with these drivers of violent extremism if we're going to tackle them properly? And as this is a growing issue, I think it's really imperative that we start to build our understanding of the intersection between negative climate impacts and the drivers of violent extremism. So the second intersecting issue I would like to discuss, and this is one that Florian did touch on, is recruitment. So I think away from the drivers, climate impacts also make communities ripe for recruitment. This is because community members are more likely to consider joining violent extremist groups if they are struggling to sustain their livelihoods due to negative climate impacts, or if they're facing increased natural disasters, such as continued floods, continued droughts, and so on, or if they live in contexts characterized by competition over resources. Ultimately, economic hardship and communal conflicts over resources create environments more conducive to violent extremism recruitment. We are already seeing an increasing number of settings or contexts, violent extremist groups offering an income to those who otherwise have lost their income. And as Florian mentioned, there's also an identity factor in this beyond actually people saying he has $500 a month, you have no income currently. So I think this is, again, we need to understand if we're going to develop responses, but also into alternative opportunities, and particularly tackling the factor of the loss of identity, we need to understand how climate impacts are increasing recruitment now and in the future when climate impacts might worsen. The third intersecting factor I want to discuss is tactics. So violent extremist groups are very quick to adapt their tactics to take advantage of climate impacts. Unfortunately, those who are countering violent extremism are not. So what we're seeing is they're very quick to adapt to the given circumstances. So some examples, I think in Somalia, Al-Shabaab, they levied taxes against drought-affected communities. They have attacked relief efforts. They've also destroyed critical infrastructure imperative to these relief efforts. Whilst in Iraq, we saw the Islamic State particularly targeting farming equipment, destroying it, destroying irrigation infrastructure, stealing livestock, burning crops, including olive trees that take years to recover afterwards if you're going to plant them. And what we've seen here is them attacking groups who are already battling with the impacts of climate change and making it almost impossible for them to recover. And these are groups who rely on agriculture for their livelihoods. Again, if we are going to understand these tactics and counter them, we need to have further research to understand exactly how they're interacting and where they might emerge. And I think this is an important area that maybe our knowledge currently is fairly weak on. And the final intersecting factor I would like to discuss is around disengagement and reintegration. So we already see that quite often natural resources play a critical role in disengagement and reintegration. But the effects of climate change can impact natural resource availability and access, which of course is going to undermine these re-entry points which are already used within disengagement and reintegration. However, I do think this provides an opportunity as addressing climate-related livelihood challenges through disengagement and rehabilitation programming can create opportunities for people to leave violent extremist groups and also create more sustainable reintegration. So I think the reason this is an opportunity is this is a clear pathway for climate adaptation and PCVE to come together and work together. So it is maybe a starting factor for us to start looking at how we can bring these two fields together more sustainably. So that's a really quick overview of kind of the 4 key areas that I think need attention. And as I think both myself and Florian have highlighted, more research is definitely needed. Because context really matters here. We need to understand the specific social system, the specific natural system, and the interaction between the two if we're going to have PCVE become more climate sensitive. So as violent extremist affected societies often have public sector institutions that are already facing or failing to meet the population's needs in these areas impacted by VE, climate change exacerbates these grievances. However, I do think this creates an opportunity for us in that we can start looking at how we can bring climate adaptation into PCVE, but also PCVE into climate adaptation. So we can possibly lead to synergies so that we can have more sustainable policy and practitioner focus in this area. I think for preventing violent extremism programs to be sustainable, they must incorporate climate adaptation. I just want to reiterate that point. And in order to do this, we need a theoretical framework that effectively integrates climate impacts, violent extremism, and societal responses to these phenomena. And I think this comprises a vital step. And myself at Coventry and others on this call, we are trying to do this, creating a framework that we can share with policymakers so we can advance the field here. However, I think for us to do this, empirical knowledge is intrinsic because context is key, and that's why I think we need to build a bigger understanding than we currently have. Which is why I think the 2 colleagues that are going to follow me are so important, because we really want to understand how it is starting to emerge in these cases, so we can start building up this framework. I also think it's why events such as this is so important, because we really need to talk about this topic more. We need to build our knowledge base. We need to start having conversations. And once again, I thank RSIS for organizing it, and the fellow panelists for sharing their expertise. I think that's a really good point to end, because I think we kind of have laid the ground, myself and Florian, for the case studies, which I think is quite important, and I'm looking forward to hearing them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dylan, for reinforcing the point that we do need a comprehensive framework of analysis to understand the intersections between climate impacts, violent extremism, and societal responses. I think the 4 points you brought up about the need for better understanding of how drivers are important, particularly your point that climate change exacerbates the drivers of violent extremism. I think that's a really key point. Recruitment, climate change, the impact of climate change on recruitment, how bad actors can exploit the impacts of climate change to sort of plug the governance gap, so to speak, and get recruits. Tactics. I took note of how you argue that violent extremist groups appear to exploit the situation tactically better than the counter-terrorist forces. That's a very interesting point. We can talk about that. And of course, the implications for disengagement and reintegration. So 4 important points that we can continue to discuss. But as Dylan pointed out, right now, we would like to have the case studies, the 2 case studies, to sort of perhaps put some flesh to the conceptual frameworks that have been articulated so well by Florian and Dylan. So with that, I first pass the time to Dr. Fathima. Fathima, please.
Yeah. Thank you. So good morning and good afternoon for others. So thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. Let me share you the presentation so that. Yeah, so I will take you through the climate crisis and its intersections with violent extremism in Kenya. So this is based on a preliminary study conducted in Kenya. So let me start with giving you an overview of the Kenyan map here to contextualize the presentation. So Kenya borders Somalia, Ethiopia, Uganda, Tanzania, and South Sudan. So naturally, it becomes a regional hub for development, infrastructure, and so forth. Due to its borders, the country also faces the risk of transnational terrorism, such as the Al-Shabaab from Somalia. So this presentation examines the nuances between climate crisis and violent extremism risk. So it also looks at the potential link between climate change and the risk associated with climate variability and violent extremism in the border regions of Kenya. So the focus is to assess whether climate change contributes to violent extremist groups' activities in Kenya's selected counties. Overall, the climate crisis does not directly cause violent extremism, but a threat multiplier. So this has been well explained by the other speakers as well. So I will look into those brief perspectives. So just to give a bit of explanation of what is violent extremism or the violent extremism context in Kenya. So since the 1990s, Kenya has experienced terrorist attacks perpetrated by terrorist networks alleged to Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, and the Islamic State. So Al-Shabaab has its origin in Somalia. So Al-Shabaab originated around in 2006 after the collapse of the Somalia's Islamic Courts Union, an offshoot of Al-Ittihad al-Islamiyah, and the existing public resentment of Ethiopia's incursion in Somalia. So however, the origins can be traced to the warlord crisis in the aftermath of the collapse of the Siad Barre regime in the 1990s. So as a transnational network, Al-Shabaab has successfully expanded its activities to other countries in the region, including Kenya. So Kenya bordering Somalia has borne the brunt of the attacks carried out by the Al-Shabaab network. So among the many attacks by the Al-Shabaab in Kenya is the Westgate Mall attack in 2013, which killed around 67 people. Then 2014, we had the Al-Shabaab that killed around 48 people in Pegotoni, that is in Lamu. Then in the same year, we had Al-Shabaab targeting a group of teachers in Mandera County, executing 28 non-Muslims at point blank range, as well as killing non-Muslims, quarry workers in separate attacks in Mandera. So these are all, most of the areas are border counties. Then in 2015, militant attacks Garissa University College, killing 148, mainly students. So in most cases, in all cases, Al-Shabaab claimed responsibility for the attacks, stating it was a revenge for what the non-Muslim government had done for innocent Muslims. So that was a narrative they have been driving forth. Then even in 2019, we had the Dusit Hotel Complex attack, killing 21 individuals, the Manda Bay airfield in 2020. So since then, we have seen attacks being intensifying in the northern, northeastern, and the coastal regions of Kenya. Where towns such as Mandera, Wajir, Garissa, and Lamu have faced attacks from the militant groups as shown in this figure. So according to this map by Ackley, the report also highlights the levels of political violence which are partly dependent on operations across the borders. These are the counties which are also having this climate crisis. So these operations may have been driven by Al-Shabaab operatives into Kenya, where peripheral localities were exploited for their operations. So overall, these peripheral Kenyan border counties in the Greater Horn region, with their proximity to Somalia, provide ample opportunities for Al-Shabaab recruitment and tactical operations due to their prevalence governance deficit, security deficit, and socioeconomic vulnerabilities associated with the harsh terrain of climate risk. So when we look at the climate impact in Kenya, so Kenya is situated in the Greater Horn of African region. It's extremely susceptible to the impacts of climate change. So for example, in 2023, after a 3-year deprivation of rain, the 3 countries, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia, were submerged with rain linked to El Nino weather phenomena, resulting in deaths and massive displacements. So these are rains that we call the flash floods immediately after the drought context. So this situation in Eastern African region highlights an urgent need for climate change adaptation and a regional approach to address the crisis. So this context is also well captured in this interview, which during some of my fieldworks which I encountered. So climate change is increasingly the frequency of drought conditions, which affects the traditional way of life of pastoral tribes in Kenya. So in Mandera and Isiolo, the majority of families keep livestock such as goat, sheep, and camel. So dry seasons are marked by men taking animals further away for grazing as they hunt for new grazing fields. So climate change has caused the dry seasons to extend longer than usual. This means men have to move away from their homes for longer periods and even stay over in some localities. This can strain families where women and children have to wait longer periods or days to feed themselves until the men return home with their animals. So that gives a bit of an idea of what drought context is in these particular counties. Then this narrative is also interesting, which I thought would give a bit of an intersection of climate and climate crisis and violent extremism. So according to this interview, it says, when everything comes crashing down as your animals are starving and dying and your grazing yields nothing, you have to find a way to look after your family. You're on the lookout for better opportunities. When you get an external assistance to find a job or some money, you rarely think twice. You need to put food on the table. You need to have a job. This need for assistance can be exploited by recruiters who fill in the void of hunger, starvation, and the need for a job. So this gives how recruiters can exploit this crisis. And at the same time, it says in the latter part of the interview, it's only in the latter stages that you understand that you're part of an extremist network. It may be too late, or you may learn to live with being part of the network. So it really blends with the recruitment processes, because you are recruited initially without knowing most of the time, and then you're already in a network and you can't get out of it. So these crises can blend into these recruitment dynamics. So finally, so what is these intersections on climate impacts and violent extremism? So there's a lack of direct causal link of climate change and violent extremism. However, climate crises can exacerbate local conflicts and underdevelopment context with other existing contextual factors. So for me, what I was interested on the ground was to see the conditions, as very well pointed out by Florian and Dylan as well. And also, I was very much keenly looking at the recruitment strategies per se. So when we have droughts, we know resource conflicts becomes aggravated. And because of sharing of resources, then there is increased competition for land. Then sometimes you migrate to new grazelands, you're bringing in new conflicts or associated conflicts. So there is a very strong connector of conflicts and recruitment, which I will explain. Then also these are localities where you have tribal clan conflicts, which are also pegged on resource conflicts and the power. So it's not only resource conflicts, but also the power in these localities which are embedded with land and the clan dynamics, and with resource scarcity, it can be aggravated. Then also these are locations where you have lack of effective policy. So there's also a security deficit because these are large chunks of areas, porous borders, where you don't see the next point for very long spaces, the distance. So that also amplifies because there's no one to come and mediate your conflicts. So you have dwindling livelihoods, death of livestock, loss of arable land, then complicating unemployment, youth vulnerability because you have no jobs. Now you have to make your move into other localities. So all those brings the strains associated with the poverty in those localities at the household level, family, and the community. Then these are also localities where you have a lot of governance deficit because these are peripheral localities where you have lack of governance. So health facilities are dwindling, other welfare provisions are dwindling. So that also amplifies. So there's other factors which also links to this climate crisis. Then migrate, so naturally, because the areas are not conducive, not enough, you have to migrate to other areas, which could be either from rural to urban, or to neighboring counties itself, or to countries for opportunity. So you may cross borders into Ethiopia or to Somalia. So those are other areas of interventions that are needed. Then also dwindling water points. That is because there's no water in these localities. When it's dwindling, you have to go further away for water and new boreholes. So those are some of the conditions and drivers. So within these conditions and drivers, how would recruitment strategies play along? So most often in my study, what I found was narratives alluded was they come at these recruiters, they don't come as recruiters or radicalizers, they come as maybe business people, important people, we call them the financials or the most important clan members who may also have their sympathetic or Al-Shabaab recruitment drive. So they come as mediators for these conflicts because since there's no law enforcement, they become the mediators, they become the arbitrators, protecting land, maybe animal conflicts, someone's cattle went into another place, another one's neighborhood. So that type of little conflicts. So mediator role becomes a very important role where you can win trust of family members and individuals. Then resolving local border disputes. So rival clan issues. So this enables them to consolidate the power, influence, and control in particular localities. So that's why if you go to particular localities, they will say, we are not part of Kenya, but we are part of something. They won't say what it is, but they will say, we are not part of Kenya, we are part of this particular clan or group or particular location with affinity to particular, I won't say lords, but it's like clan leaders, which sometimes may be sympathetic to Al-Shabaab. Then also, sometimes they also create or aggravate conflicts so that they can show their importance. as providing welfare and things like that. So that also has been a narrative which is going on. Whenever there is this drought crisis and issues going on, they bring in some form of, rivalries to create conflicts so that they can come and intervene. Then the natural aspect of addressing grievances, they become very interested in providing welfare, providing you a job or other livelihood opportunities, or even in family settings, providing healthcare, which is very important. It's like maternal health and things like that. As I told you before, as a condition, there is no access. So access and facilities. So these people, recruiters or radicalizers find very interesting to give healthcare and other provisions. And this is very interesting because we see healthcare as a minor thing, but it can bring the trust of an entire family. So now if the boy says, I would like to join this group, there's no way the family will say no, because when no one was there to help, these are the people who came and gave us health care and things like that. Then also assisting migration of individuals, providing jobs. They become like, they plan out very nicely on where to migrate, where will you go and stay, what type of job you will give. And then also mobility and new dynamics which comes with this migration, because when you migrate, you go to a new locality, you don't have your kinship. So there are, you need to have new bonds, new friendships. So that also pegs in, because they will give a place where they have their own, recruiters have their own sympathizers. So now you're already within these networks. Then these are also localities where you have the crime-terrorism linkage. That's the illicit cross-border trade, which is going on in those localities, because these are also routes for human smuggling, human trafficking networks. So this also very nicely blends with this migration, mobility, and also incorporate these young people, especially, into these crime-terrorism linkages. Then we also, and the other important area is this climate-linked narratives, which comes on board with governance deficits. Like, for example, look, they might bring in the religious dimension, say this is all God's curse because you have not been religious enough. So we are suffering here. And added to that, we are in a Christian state where the government is not looking after us. So that type of marginalization drive for in the name of religion or ethnic can be very compelling narrative, especially for people who are impoverished in these peripheral localities. And they also bring very nicely the blend of a need for a caliphate. If you have a caliphate, we have equality. We won't be suffering like this in this particular country, that type of narrative. So that becomes compelling for recruitment. Then youth idleness, disillusion, youth, we see pockets of young people just idling. So when you are embedded with these false narratives or disinformation, whether it's online or mainly offline, because these are localities which are highly in the peripheral, but in the urban areas, we also have the online dynamics with the messages going across. So it becomes compelling, motivating factors to join these networks. Then very important is this gender dynamics, where most of the, because men go for grazing, some women also do, but majority is men. Most of the areas, shops, livelihoods within are by women. So you will see most women-headed households. So now when with this crisis, climate crisis in this border region, when things are dwindling, naturally they come as facilitators for income avenues and so forth. And they also come as prospective bridegrooms for young women, especially within the Muslim community, which is also a very big need. And that marriage also is a very crisis, because slow onset disasters like droughts, which goes for 3 to 5 years, means you can't, with dwindling conditions, men have to provide mahar. And mahar means a form of money to get married. Now you can't get married, so recruiters even come in, facilitate as providing money to get married or providing bridegrooms for the women. So that type of dynamics also fit in within this context. Then finally is this recruitment points and tactics, as Dylan highlighted, mainly the tactics change. It's also points because water holes have become, with further movement for water, those water locations or water points becomes interesting areas for recruitment, because you walk long distances, naturally you discuss, so these narratives becomes embedded. So you see recruiters exploiting these type of water points, localities for their recruitment drive. So those are some of the findings from the field, and also to give you briefly what came from the community as recommendations itself, is to have a nuanced understanding of the interplay between peace building, preventing and countering violent extremism, and the impact of climate crisis is important for meaningful interventions. So you need to have all three. Then stronger community-led policies on peace building based on future projections of climate variations in the Horn of African region is also important. So how can we project? These days we have very interesting programs from IGAD that looks into future projection and peace building. So I think that is also very important. Then facilitating, constructing climate smart infrastructure such as dam, irrigation mechanisms, boreholes are also very important in these communities, especially aided by techno-smart initiatives. Then there are many organizations working with local peace efforts. There's a lot. But how do we bring an integrated effort, which was also highlighted by Dylan? Well, because we see everyone in cocoons. There is peace building, there is some development going on, but how do we bring this together? So how do we mainstream climate risk strategies with PCVE and broader peace building overall? Then also bringing counter alternative narratives, especially when these narratives are floating in during these periods. But countering and alternative narratives will not make sense if we do not address the structural causes that brings in these narratives. So they need to go along one another. Then finally, building peaceful and prepared villages that can be resilient to these climate impacts. So basically, those were some of the recommendations. So thank you so much and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fathima, for the very rich and fascinating presentation on the Kenyan situation. Because of time, I will perhaps pass the time now to Dr. Huda for his case study. Huda, please.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to share my presentation here. I'm really fascinated with the presentation from Dr. Florian and Dylan, and also Dr. Fathima, that set the tone of my discussions. Florian talking about the intersectionality, especially Dylan talking about intersectionality, the driver recruitment, as well as tactic and disengagement, and Dr. Fathima share about the finding. Here I'm going to share a little bit about case studies in Indonesia. I call this phenomenon will be the grievance hunter, because the terrorists, the extremists in Indonesia has been perfecting their tactic of how to bolster their image, especially during the crisis like this, But what I mean by climate change here, it is very much linked into the disaster. This is one of the examples. Usually they use a narrative, especially in social media. This is one of the examples, how they display a picture of a specific disaster in an area, and then using a language, emotive narrative, and as well as a possibility for them to attract financial support. And they put some announcement with a bank account and things like this. And this is an example of when in my book, I wrote about the role of narrative in the process of mobilization of funding. I propose, this is again the proposed framework that I've been developing. And this process is still this framework is still work in progress, expanding the work of Ariel Kruskanski, especially on the need network or narrative, what he call it is 3N. Here, the argument is that, as Dylan and Florian has mentioned, oftentimes this mobilization of an individual to join a specific violent group is oftentimes has to do with an identity. So the need here will be individual or precondition is about personality, and the existing of specific disaster-related climate change issue will provide the opportunity for the group to ignite the loss of significant and open up the possibility for in the potential recruit for significant gains, and it is with activation of that need, that personal need, the narrative that they use either coming from Takfiri or Salafi, and also oftentimes using an online and offline. And this is move into the next step with the next stage, with this identity fusion. Well, individual first identify the cause into their identity, their belief system, or then gradually fuse into that identity being proposed. And this is the first case will be I will use Jamaah Islamiyah as the case for non-specialists in this topic. Jamaah Islamiyah is the Southeast Asian terrorist network in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia, has been around since 1993. And then mid last year, they decided to disband itself. But but this case study, I think before the disbandment, JI encouraged members to volunteer in disaster relief effort. This is one of the example. This is one of the guy posted. This guy named Masud Izul Mujahid is one of the senior member of JI, posting how specific disaster, and then using religious narrative, that saying that jangan diam terhadap maksiat. So you religious narrative by saying that this is part of the God punishment, as Fathima has said, like a specific incident, specific disaster, oftentimes framed through religious narrative. And then for JI member, they encourage new members and existing member to get involved in the humanitarian activity. Because they also disaster relief, the quick delivery of aid compared to bureaucratic delay, that in this context can help JI to gain a trust. And then with this disaster, JI has a shifted perception, reframing image, shifting perception from a terrorist group to humanitarian organization. And they are so good in terms of designing and picturing their activity. Looking at this one, it's not straightforward. Let's say we are part of terrorist organization, or not straightforward also, please join our cause. Rather, they display a very harmful and emotional and emotive picture. Let's say here, this is an Indonesian, basically picturing a children, they need food, and also here children need water, and then all this emotional like this. And then because of this very powerful design and look official, and very difficult for outsider to understand that this kind of advertisement on social media, this narrative that has been advocated by JI, it's actually linked to a violent extremist group. So therefore, with this type of tactic, JI managed to gather so much resources and also support coming from the public. And also there's a group that also use a similar tactic called Jamaah Ansarud Daulah, or JAD. This is a group basically is an Indonesian violent extremist group that pledge allegiance to ISIS. So they survive both online and offline, and then they always use a social media, especially in this context of a climate change. They use a specific climate incident as a way to boost their image as the defender of the earth, for instance. This is one of the example within the earthquake in Cianjur. Cianjur is one of the area in East Java. They dispatched two organizations linked to JAD called Bihul Khairun Ummah to front themselves as a humanitarian activist. As Dr. Fathima mentioned, they never come to a place to display themselves or to openly say that they are linked to jihad, but they use a specific an organization to show that I'm your defender. I'm here to help you. So Jamaah Ansarullah also using the same tactic. Another group also, this is one of group, Jamaah Ansarul Syariah. It's a splinter group from JI. They also using the same tactic too. So as we can hear, the exploitation of climate change extend beyond direct aid effort. You know, they also involved in even like plantation. You know, like they plant trees. They do humanitarian activities. So how do we deal with this kind of activities? And as has been mentioned by Fathima, Dr. Fathima, and this is not uniquely Southeast Asian, a group like, this is a global pattern, you know, group like Al-Shabaab in Somalia and Boko Haram, Nigeria, use similar strategies to gain recruit and empower through crisis. The narrative control, they understand that the violent extremist group need to have a narrative control. Extremists position themselves as a savior, undermining the state and attracting new followers. And this is also Dr. Fathima has said that how and why do they get involved? And why do specific individuals get attracted to this? There is, of course, no singular reason, but it is always a gender process. The internet, especially social media, enable them to contribute. So in one of the cases is one of the example, Indonesian migrant worker who live in Hong Kong, attracted with the narrative on social media, and because of that one, he end up, you know, distributed some of the income, and within that social media, they get to know one of the ISIS recruiter, and then they start to have a dating, and that's how this poor lady get involved in the narrative of a violent extremist group. So this process is also gender. And here I propose how to, as Dr. Fathima said, we need to have a counter narrative. So also Dylan also mentioned, we need to come up with something. Last year, I was involved in the process of designing the roadmap of strategic communication for my government at the NPT, the National Agency on Counterterrorism. I came up with these 4 stages of how can we counter the narrative, how can we do the strategic communication. Number 1 is straightforward situational analysis. We need to understand what is really going on, which kind of issue that you want to tackle. In this in the context of climate change, of course, we need to study what are the narrative that the group have been using, what are the disaster climate change related incident that has been exploiting the group. We got to know this analysis, we got to know the situation. The next thing will be, we need to understand the target audience, because speaking to people in the village will be different to people to talk to our target audience in the city. And we need to map also the stakeholder. And then after we are once we understand fully our target audience and also the stakeholder that will involve in this kind of campaign, then we can have a strategic development of a specific narrative. Because we cannot coin narrative, we cannot develop narrative alone. We need to work with so many stakeholders. And in this context, last one will be, we need to assess the narrative that we have been produced. So this cycle of process is very critical for us to have. And next, and this is the example in terms of understanding the target audience. The target audience, this is a research by Theo and Gruber in 2022. They classified at least a 4 domain of the way we need to engage our target audience or counter narrative. We can see alternative, what is they differentiate between what is alternative narrative, what are the critical thinking, what are the counter narrative, what are the remedial. If we want to have one-way messaging, so here let's say the positive narrative, then we are talking about the general public, the macro one. So we can use, we can come up with utilizing people around positive vision of cohesive society. This is a broader message that general public can use, but this type of message is more one way. The counter narrative also we can do straightforward, but this is one way. We need to counter right away the false interpretation of a group and a specific incident related to climate change issue. So this is the positive narrative can be considered as a proactive resilience, and then the counter narrative can be considered as a reactive mitigation. But if we want to target individual level, which is in the level of individual to remedial intervention, then this de-radicalization or F-ramping or reduce the vulnerability. In the context of social media, we can identify a specific account. This is one individual level. But at the group level, we can come up with a critical thinking. For instance, we can have a movie screening, we can have a discussion, or book launching, we can have a discussion. This is one of the example, one of my campaign about the role of narrative in terrorism finance. I use one of the former here, Munir, to have a conversation with the Central Java governor who runs for president. And because of that specific tactic, we managed to gather around at least, I think this is 2 years ago, it's a 1.5 million, 1 million audience. But in this context, we need to educate the donors, educate the partner. What is the yardstick of success if we want to carry out a counter narrative? If we want to engage the general public, then virality is very important. But if we want to come up with a behavior change, a different tactic is required, which is not enough only having online intervention. We need to have both online and offline in the same time. So this is one example. And another things that I mentioned earlier, besides understanding the audience, we need to also understand the stakeholders. And this is one of the example of how this is one of my campaign on the need for reintegration of Indonesian from Syrian camp. And I identify into what are the objectives, what are the target audience, what are the message, what are the channels. Must have very different layer. You cannot have a one message for everyone because it won't be that effective. For instance, if I run the general public, let's say the objective is to reduce stigma against the returnee. So the target audience will be general public, communities, and media. So the message will be not all returnee are threat, rehabilitation work when it done right. This is one example. So I use the channel as social media campaign, TV discussion, community dialogue. This is one of the example. Here also I classified into different things. If I want to engage with the law enforcement, will it be different. If I want to engage with the local leader, will be different, and the message also different, and the channel also different. Because, and this is one of the examples. This is very practical. If we want to convey the message, there is a formula which I call it peso. We can use a paid media, or we can earn the reputation, or we can, when we come up with a powerful message that relate to general public, so the possibility of having share will be very good, very big. So with the share, our last one will be the own one. It is, I think, when we want to run a specific project, it's good that we have our own media, where other media outlet or other general public can always refer to. So this formula of peso, one of the possible consideration to do that. And lastly, because when we do the stakeholder within the step of strategic development, we need to have a simulation. We need to try first, and then we meet implementation. And the last one, when we want to do the assessment, we need to have a JETSI perspective. JETSI is a gender equality, disability, and social inclusion. And when we do the impact, we need to assess what are, in terms of awareness, desire, interest and desire, decision, action, and behavior. To conclude, this is the conclusion of my talk will be violent extremist group exploit societal grievances, including climate-related disaster to recruit and gain legitimacy. It is similar what Dr. Fathima has mentioned. Position themselves as a protector of vulnerable communities, Therefore, urgent need for strategic communication to counter extremist narrative and build resilience. Resilience is very important here. And to do that, we need to have a proactive transmedia storytelling approach, can address climate change and violent extremism, promoting community unity. I emphasize here on transmedia storytelling because we need to find, we need to treat every media differently. We cannot lump them together in the same box as a media, because media has a unique strength and weaknesses. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Pak Huda, for very excellent presentations. There's been a fair bit to digest. So, and keeping in mind that perhaps not everybody in the audience are specialists in the nexus between climate change and extremism. Good to see some questions coming in. Please bring them in into the chat. I'll get the ball rolling by first of all trying to provide my layman's synthesis, my rather basic synthesis of what I've just heard. So I will appreciate if the our four speakers can sort of respond to my analysis of the problem of what the problem is. So what is the problem, right? To me, based on what I've heard, this is what I think I've heard, right? Climate change, the key impact of climate change is that essentially, bottom line is it disrupts livelihoods, right? It is primarily an economic, social impact. It disrupts livelihoods, giving rise to example for, as we have heard, rise in unemployment, youth vulnerabilities, rural-urban migrations, essentially creates stress communities, which also leads in turn to a loss of identity, psychological dislocations in the community. And what really happens after that, the basic problem is the socio-economic and identity crisis created by climate change, climate impacts, create the vulnerabilities that can then be exploited by bad actors, right? So I'm saying that, so ultimately the basic problem is the socio-economic and identity crisis created by climate impacts generate the vulnerabilities that can then be exploited by bad actors. And we have heard, right, from the four speakers, how the bad actors respond to. Essentially, it sounds to me like they provide alternative governance. I mean, they are mediators, they provide jobs, migration assistance, aid, humanitarian relief, security, right? And on top of that, they legitimize these services through their own narratives. Pak Huda talked about takfir ideology, Salafi jihadism, the idea that the caliphate is the solution, narrative control. So, so I've just sketched out what I just heard. So what do you guys think? Is that a fair assessment of the problem? Anybody can come in?
I can start. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, that essentially is a strong part of it. I mean, I would add that it would also potentially highlight governments' inaction in certain areas. So when we have governments failing to address populations at the margin, the impacts of climate change and the failure to address these would also further highlight this and give another area for manipulation. And yeah, I would also maybe highlight in terms of I mean, reiterating the fact that I think violent extremist groups are quicker to react to climate change, whether as I think both Huda and Fathima demonstrated, looking at using it tactically, but also in terms of using it for its recruitment and really manipulating the fact that maybe there is government inaction in these areas. However, I mean, I think, as we stressed, we need to look at this more, because we are starting to highlight some of the key areas. There could be ones that we are missing. So this really is kind of an area at its nascent stage, and I would really like to separate violent extremism from conflict. And in order to do that, we need to really start having more studies that are specifically looking at violent extremism and climate change.
And Florian, Fathima,
Yeah, thank you. I think, first of all, thank you, Fathima and Noor, for the presentations. I think that was really rich and really helpful. Dylan's too, but I had heard elements of that before. I think that, just to reiterate, I think the point that Dylan made at the end is really important, right? There's like most of the examples that we see. So I guess there's distinct literatures a bit. Like there's quite a bit more on the disaster response side, where there's some research on that. Everything else on the climate specific side is coming out as a side effect, right? It's not like it's about studying climate security and the relations to conflict and insecurity. And as doing that, we see, well, look, there's something with violent extremism. And I think that's where Dylan's point is right. We need to put a distinct effort. If violent extremism is something distinct different, we need to put a dedicated effort into studying that. And I think there's like an interesting multidisciplinarity of bringing a lot of different elements together to study that comprehensively and through an integrated approach. I think what is interesting, and Noor specifically sort of with the counter-narrative element, I think that was really interesting. What we need is to keep the response side in mind, right? And I think that is, again, where climate change is a little bit specific and different than some other natural disasters would be, for instance. The number of intervention points of a drought to play out in livelihood deterioration and insecurities are multifold compared to an earthquake or a volcano breaking out, right? There's not much. I mean, that is a sudden onset thing. But if you take a drought, there are multiple steps, there are multiple paths along the way. That is nothing that happens from today to tomorrow. And I think that is really important to keep in mind and study also what are the differences of different types of events and how is they providing different dynamics. But then it creates this real challenge for the humanitarian relief actors, and in the context that we are mostly interested in, then also in combination with peace building. We saw that in Somalia, where we see humanitarian response is necessary, right, to provide drought relief, to get to Al-Shabaab held territories. That means working with Al-Shabaab. That means actually providing Al-Shabaab with some of the narratives or ability to build some of these narratives, right? Being the de facto state actor, being a de facto authority that is enabling aid and service delivery. And I think that is something that is worth pointing out, because it makes the peace building side so much more complicated, right? Because everything that is happening there and that is necessary to provide relief is countering a peace and state building process. And I think that's sort of where we need to keep the response side also in mind.
Thanks. Any other comments, Fathima or Huda?
I can just add on that more in line with, I'm more interested on how recruitment pathways navigate during this period, as Florian highlighted very well. These are slow onset disasters. So, this is, I mean, at least you have a projection. And when the government fails or there is a governance deficit, it gives a lot of legitimacy for these organizations or VOs and their work. So how do we look into that from a recruitment angle was what my key area of interest was. And I find a lot of loopholes that are being, not loopholes, a lot of areas that are being used in this recruitment and also in tactical drives. So it's very interesting how they use it in narrative building. Even Noor, Huda has highlighted a lot. These narratives become very compelling in an area where you have nothing to hear, but you are in a very disastrous context with your family on board and listening to these false, I won't say false also, because there are some truth in it, you see. So the governance deficit very nicely put forward as a misinformation or disinformation drive to bring these nicely crafted narratives. Then provision of services. That gives a lot of legitimacy. There are areas where even though you don't say it's Al-Shabaab areas, they give a lot of, there are many sympathizers in these areas because of these welfare provisions and so forth. So how do we look at it as a recruitment drive, as a recruitment initiative to mitigate VEOs and their influence in these particular localities. True, we need to look at PCV, and then it works within the broader peace building efforts. So how do we look into it both? Because there are similarities and there are light differences in both contexts. And also look from a tactical end. I can't give a lot of examples on the drought, which I can also, it's a long thing, but look at the rainy seasons and the tactical drives which change, especially with these flash flood timings. So we have a lot of tactical changes also that are happening on the ground in terms of combat experiences. So there's a lot we can look in, but there's more need for further research, because these are just preliminary studies based on our experiences on the ground working, but more nuanced understanding is needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Huda?
Yeah, I think we can classify our approach, the way we look at this one, into 3 areas, which is what are the strategic, what are the operational, what are the tactical. The strategic part, definitely, as Fathima has mentioned, and also Florian has touched a bit, will be on the role of the narrative, how they hijack the narrative that it's purely humanitarian climate change issue, but they turn it in a way, let's say, oh, the government is inefficient. So the rise of, they're strengthening their position. They work in the narrative level. And then within the Islamic context, for instance, they start to hijack the narrative within the Quran and Hadith. With Fathima mentioned, there are some truth in it, but they come up with a very wild interpretation as a way to boost their own image. So that is the strategic part. We need to work on it. So in this context, maybe counter-narrative or alternative narrative will be critical to look at. This is the level of scholar, like those who are thinking, putting to challenge basically their narrative. And when we come up with that message, being correct is only one element, but another level will be being connect. You need, when you come up with the message, being correct is a must, but you must to connect your target audience. What in it for them, So number 2 will be the operational level. Since this group will assist in Indonesian context or in Southeast Asia context in the Philippines, we know that they are problematic group, but especially in Indonesia will be very difficult because they are working in such a gray area. So I come there to help, let's say, the needy. I come there just to help those who become the victim of a eruption in Merapi, in a mountain eruption. So how can we stop that recruitment part? And the last one will be the tactical part. How can we deal with a group like this? And then we do know that this is my lead into recruitment and resource mobilization, especially in terms of funding, So this is another layers of analysis that we can come up with and at the same time, we might lead into more practical one. I think this is my comment, and I think Prof. Kumar has done a great justice for this discussion.
Thank you. We have questions coming in on the chat, so I'll take the first one from Kenneth from Terrorism Center ICPVTR. It's a good question. Essentially, his point is, do we really need a new framework to understand the nexus between climate change and violent extremism? We already have existing frameworks. I mean, how is the current PCVE framework lacking in the context of climate change? Do we really need to go one step further to adopt the language of climate activists instead of using the language of PCVE? Well, that's an interesting question. Anybody want to take a look, take a stab at it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it might be directed at me as I talked about frameworks, so I can maybe start. I mean, I think the reason we need a framework is we need to look at how climate change is interacting with PCV. So just looking at PCV and not really bringing in climate change, I think is maybe an issue. And in terms of what already exists, I would argue that this, if we just start looking at individual areas, we don't really see how these are all interacting together, and I think this hinders our responses. And also, the reason I think a framework is important is what we need to understand is exactly how climate change and violent extremism are interacting. What happens when you start developing a framework is people start to build on it and add to it. And I think currently there are a number of key issues that are missing, and that will be missing even more in the future when we start to see climate change interacting more with violent extremism. So by creating a framework, what we do is we're essentially calling people to improve it. And by doing this, we start to build our knowledge on how climate change and violent extremism are intersecting and how we can build responses to this. Ultimately, for me, the reason to develop a framework is to develop responses, because if we can really understand how climate change and violent extremism intersect, we can really understand how we can respond to this, and we can start developing holistic responses that take all of these factors together. And this is different to what is currently happening in terms of PCVE frameworks, because they are not really considering climate impacts and some of the hidden impacts of climate change.
Anybody else want to come in on this? All right, if not, I'll go to the next question from Benjamin Mock of ICPVTR. For Dylan again, do you have any suggestions on how your framework may be adopted and generalized across CVA practitioners? Are we looking for the creation of an overarching organization, or are we looking for more general change in thinking that will be hopefully adopted? And for all speakers, given the wide range of climate change issues, is there any specific one that bears further research in the near future? Example, water scarcity, rising sea levels, especially in regard to violent extremism. So Dylan first, perhaps.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is a really important point, because what happens generally with frameworks is they're developed within academia without talking to policymakers, and then it takes a decade before we really see this coming into policy. And this is what we don't want. What we really want is to develop a framework in conjunction with policymakers, so that we can understand how they can utilize this knowledge better. Ultimately, as I already said, it's about how we can build responses that tackle the intersection between climate change and violent extremism. And to do this, we really need to engage with policymakers from the start. So for me, it's not about creating a new overarching organization. It is rather exactly about how we can change the way of thinking. How can we, from the beginning, start engaging with policymakers and saying, like, these are the emerging areas, but what are you seeing? So it's what we are actually trying to do is we are starting to develop a framework, but we are trying to do it in conjunction with policymakers, so that rather than having this decade time before it starts making into policy, we can start from the beginning, looking at what information do you actually need. We don't, because we can develop a framework that we think is important, but then they're like, actually that doesn't help us. So how can we make sure that the information and the type of framework we're developing actually feeds specifically into responses, and that's how we are trying to approach it right now. I think the second part of that question I will leave for the rest who maybe have more to say on that.
Yes, please. Any second question? Given the wide range of climate change issues, is there any specific one that you think bears further research in the near future, especially in relation to violent extremism? Anybody have any thoughts on this?
Maybe I'm trying to share a bit, Benjamin. I think we need to look at any climate change related disaster that might involve possible mobilization of groups like JI and IC or JID. Where the state will be not that effective to deal with that climate change related issue. So we need to identify, let's say, especially in Indonesian context, Indonesia is a ring of fire, anything to do with the explosion of mountain volcanoes, for instance. We need to think, how like Dylan said, what are the policymaker must be aware, the possibility of non-state actor jump into this, disaster to gain recruit and resources. So that is that kind of thing. If my straightforwardly will be any climate related issue that open up the possibility of mobilization of so many resources, like that.
Any other comments on this point?
Just to add, I think, like, for example, the example itself, water scarcity. There are a lot of research in that and all, there are a lot of explanation. But how can we link it as a climate issue and also as a trend because even water is provided by these recruiters in particular localities. So they are doing the welfare also. So it's a scarcity issue, and they are filling in that gap. That link is what needs to be explored in mobilization, as Noor highlights, and also in recruitment drives. So I would look from that end. So there are clear lines of threads we can look into within these particular areas. So it would be very much clear set rather than looking into broader frameworks, because we already have peace building frameworks. We have different frameworks. We even have PCV frameworks. So for example, we have in Kenya, we are very much far ahead with county action plans, that every county has their own action plan based on county issues. So how do we bring, especially in these border regions, the climate nexus into these county action plans is a discussion with policymakers. And it's an important discussion because these are counties affected by climate issues. So how can we bring that into our county action plans? It's also some area we need to think about. Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, just maybe to briefly add to that, I think also, I mean, there's so much really still to look at in all of that space, right? So that, I mean, if you're a PhD student anywhere in the call, that's a topic, right? There's so many different areas where you can really like dive in and where there are really open questions. I think that whole, we touched upon that a bit, but this whole question between the different types of fast, slow onset dynamics, like how does that play out? How does different types of governance responses play out and matter, right? All these questions around discourse and narratives that Huda mentioned, there's so much interesting stuff in relation to that. I think that is really, really important and great to look at.
Thank you. Mindful of the time, perhaps you can take one more question from Arlini. Interesting question about securitization. If the desired response to climate change being a driver for violent extremism is through a livelihood development response, do you think that the securitization of climate change by depicting vulnerable and displaced groups as security risks is an effective approach? I think what she means is if we depict vulnerable and displaced groups as a risk in the sense that they can be exploited, I mean, is this a good approach or is this not a good approach? I mean, anybody want to come in on that?
I can come in on that. I mean, certainly, I think it's a really good question, right? But I also think if we look at the research that is out there on climate change and conflicts and climate change and security, we see that climate change is a security issue, right? And that means we need to treat it that way. That does not mean it's a military issue. There might be roles for the military, but what those roles are is a distinct question, right? Because I think that's why the frameworks are so important, and what Dylan mentioned about like guiding policy in that process and having the frameworks. We have a framework for studying climate change and the relation to security. And it's like climate change has an impact on people's vulnerability, which translates into situations of insecurity in certain contexts under certain circumstances that are distinct, right? There's a role for security actors in when it turns into violence type of thing, there's a certain role. But the military is not going to solve people's vulnerability, and the military is not going to be, even though they certainly have large emissions, but solving those is not going to solve climate change, right? So we need to bring all of these things together. And that is where securitizing the issue in the traditional sense is maybe a good thing, because it allows us to make it a high priority policy issue, right? To put resources behind that, not military resources, but overall resources. And I think that is where I would be like, securitization, I'm not worried about. If it would be like a framing towards militarization, then I think we have a problem, right? Because we're not solving any of those livelihood development response issues with military responses, right? We need substantive different actors. And the challenge is we need the synergy and the interaction and the integration of those actors to work together, because the complexity we're facing is there and requires a different set of responses. Yeah.
I could also come in there maybe if there's time. I mean, I think ultimately what we're trying to do is develop responses, and as Florian mentioned, not military responses. So so it's not about these vulnerable and displaced groups are not the issue. The failure to respond to them being vulnerable and displaced is the issue. And what we need to do is develop responses to prevent this from becoming a security issue. So I think that the main point here is ultimately the issue is the lack or the failure of response, not the fact that we are seeing migration or we're seeing vulnerable groups. What we need to do is we need to address these factors before they become a security risk.
Thank you. We have basically run out of time, but one of the things I wanted to say is that one of the major reasons why RSIS ICPVTR wanted to bring together these excellent speakers today is to sort of like raise awareness of how climate change does have implications for violent extremism. And I know the audience that is here today, usually, I mean, they are, whenever we have ICPVTR webinars, the focus is on violent extremism. And sometimes, in fact, we don't really talk much about the impact of climate change on violent extremism and the nexus. So I hope that all of us, our colleagues here, the audience, would have enjoyed this seminar. And more than that, I hope that there will be interest to sort of explore the nexus further by maintaining contact with our colleagues here, Florian, Dylan, and Dr. Fathima, and of course, Pak Huda, because I think, at least myself, it is quite clear that the arguments they presented constitute a compelling case for further research and exploration of the nexus between climate impacts and violent extremism. So I hope that this is just the beginning of the conversation and that we can maintain the conversation going forward. So with that, we have come to the close of our webinar. It gives me great pleasure to thank very much our excellent speakers, Florian Krampe, Dylan Driscoll, Dr. Fathima, Badurdeen, and of course, Dr. Huda Ismail. We've had a very enriching session, and I hope to sort of maintain contact and to continue the conversation with all of you. And for colleagues who are on the call, there will be a feedback code, a QR code which will be flashed on the screen. We would appreciate if you could take a few minutes to sort of just give your feedback on the seminar, on the webinar, and what other points you would like to bring up, especially in terms of how would you like to see us take this conversation forward. So with that, thank you very much, and hope to see all of you again. Thank you very much.
Thanks for hosting. Thanks for joining.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having us.
Thank you so much too.
Thank you. Stay in touch.